All right, let's talk about occlusal contacts. We've got a couple main concepts here that are going to set the stage for this. Remember the curve of Spee? The curve of Spee runs from the head of the condyle, touches all the cusp tips of all the teeth, and is in a 4-inch radius. The curve of Wilson does the same thing, but it's in this left to right. Remember in tooth morphology where we talked about that lingual inclination of all the mandibular molars? That follows that curve of Wilson. Monson sphere puts this all together. If you can imagine a 4-inch radius ball that touches all the cusp tips, including the condyles, you've got Monson sphere. Let's take a look at your diagram with Engel's classification, breaking it down to Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. Class 1 is 70% of the population know that both the molar and the canine are centered. Don't forget, even if a patient is Class 1, you can still have a malocclusion. On your test, it clearly states that all questions will relate to Class 1 unless it says otherwise. So when we're going through these occlusal relationships and pathways, we just have to worry about Class 1. There are a few exceptions, but they should be obvious when you get there. Class 2 only represents 25% of the population, and in this case, the mandible is positioned distally. This results in a big overjet or a deep overbite. Class 3 only represents 5% of the population. We're going to keep talking about tooth contacts and relationships before we get into how they move in relation to each other. Let's draw some of this out together. I've got some good tools that are going to help you in your exam. Draw this out with me so that when you get to your exam you can draw these and use it as a tool to figure out these questions. Let's start by drawing a picket fence diagram. Start by drawing a W like this for the maxillary third molar. You can draw lines up, then we'll continue with W's for the second molar. The first molar, make sure and draw a little longer extension on the distal part of that W. I'll show you why in a second. We've got two premolars, a canine, and we've got two incisors. Let's come down on the mandible and we'll draw lines down for the third molar, the second molar, the first molar. We pick up that distal buccal cusp with 5 cusps on that molar, the first premolar, the second premolar, the canine, the lateral, and the central. Remember, we're always talking about Class 1 here on your test, where the mesiobuccal cusp of that maxillary first molar lies in the mesiobuccal groove of the mandibular first molar, and the maxillary canine lies between the mandibular canine and the first premolar. We know that on the mandible, the working cusps are the buccal cusps, and on the maxilla, the working cusps are the lingual cusps. Working cusps tend to be broader and a little bit more blunted. Non-working cusps do not contact in opposing teeth. They tend to be sharper, and they oppose grooves and embrasures. As a general rule, a maxillary tooth will oppose its class counterpart and the tooth distal to it. So looking at our picket fence diagram, if we look at the maxillary second molar, you'll see that it contacts the mandibular second molar and the mandibular third molar. Same thing is true all the way up on a maxillary lateral incisor. The maxillary lateral incisor contacts the mandibular lateral incisor and the mandibular canine. So that rule holds true throughout. For the mandible, similarly, it will contact its class counterpart and the tooth mesial to it. So looking at our diagram, you can see where that holds true. It's common to get a question of a picture of a tooth and asking which tooth it will contact. So the first step is to identify the tooth. Often, it's the mandibular first molar or a maxillary first molar, something that's readily identifiable, and you need to know which arch it's in, and then recognize its class counterpart, and the tooth mesial or distal, depending on whether it's a maxillary or mandibular tooth. You can remember that easily from this picket fence diagram. Now let's draw a diagram that shows the occlusal view of these same teeth. I want you to draw 3 circles here for molars, like this. We're going to draw 2 circles shaped like this for premolars. We have a canine, a lateral, and a central. Let's do the same thing for the maxillary arch. 3 circles for molars, 2 premolars, a canine, 2 incisors. Let's apply what we know here. We know that on the mandible, the buccal cusps are the working cusps. So when we have contacts, they're going to be on these buccal cusps. Draw those in with me. When we get up to the anteriors, the mandibular teeth are going to contact on the incisal edge. Let's draw lines in there. Let's go ahead and mark the supporting cusps on the maxillary. Remember, these are the lingual cusps. When we get to the anterior teeth, these do not contact on the incisal edge. The incisal edge of a mandibular tooth will rest against a marginal ridge of the maxillary tooth. The lines we saw on the incisal edge of mandibular teeth correspond with lines on the lingual surface of maxillary teeth. Let's overlay these 2 diagrams and we'll put on the opposing cusps. Let's relate this to our picket fence. So if we start with the mandibular molars, we see that the maxillary molar would contact it in a central fossa and a distal marginal ridge. This follows throughout the arch. Central fossa, distal marginal ridge. When we get to the premolars, we have our supporting cusp. The supporting cusp from the maxilla contacts on that distal marginal ridge. Let's go to the maxilla. Refer back to our picket fence. You'll see on the molars where it contacts a mesial marginal ridge. So let's draw that in. We've got central fossa, we've got mesial marginal ridge. That holds true for all the molars. When we get to the premolars, the mandibular premolar contacts on that mesial marginal ridge. Rather than memorizing individual cusp positions, we can use these 2 diagrams working together to figure this out when you get to your test without a lot of memorization. Put these to work for you. Let's apply these diagrams. You might get a question that says, the buccal cusp of a maxillary second premolar opposes what? Looking at your picket fence diagram, let's find the maxillary second premolar. The buccal cusp, we know, is a non-working cusp. So it lies in that embrasure between the mandibular second premolar and the mandibular first molar. One question they like to ask a lot is about the anterior teeth and which teeth contact. There are only 2 teeth in the mouth that only contact one opposing teeth. Do you know what they are? Can you figure it out from our diagram? That's right. Look at the picket fence. You see that mandibular central incisor? It only contacts the maxillary central. And look at the maxillary third molar. It only contacts the mandibular third molar. Those 2 teeth are unique in that they only contact one other tooth. Make sure and note that. Another way we've seen this asked on the anterior teeth is they will ask which teeth contact the maxillary central incisor. Don't be tripped up here. This is easy if you look at your picket fence diagram or your occlusal drawing. You will see that both indicate that there are 2 mandibular incisors that contact that maxillary central. One seemingly tricky way we've seen this asked is they will ask about a cusp tip. Let's use an example. If you take the maxillary first molar, it contacts the mandibular first molar. They might say, which cusp inclines are you likely to see function during normal eccentric movements? If we look at our diagram, we know that a maxillary will contact the mandibular molar, so it could contact either of these cusp inclines. We also know that this rests into a maxillary molar. We could see contact on either of these inclines. What does that leave out? This lingual incline of the lingual cusps. Don't be tripped up by these types of questions. They sound confusing at first, but when you put your diagrams to work, it makes it very simple, and you're going to nail these. Let's take these same diagrams and now go through transition into movements and see how they can really work for us. When we get into movements, there's two different ways they can talk about movements. They can talk about the movements in general, and then you'll also see questions about specific cusps and specific pathways that they take. Let's start with the movements. I can guarantee you're going to see a diagram with an arrow on it asking you to identify protrusion. It can look one of two ways. You might see a mandibular arch with an arrow that looks like this. The question would state something like this: what mandibular movement is shown here? Obviously, the answer is protrusion. The other two movements that you need to identify are non-working and working. When you see an arrow like this, the first thing you've got to do is orient yourself. Make sure you know where you are in the arch. In this case, identify that mandibular first molar, identify that you're on the right side. Remember, the mandible is the one that moves. So in this case, put your pen down on the point, move your paper. What's happening there? The mandible is shifting to the right. So let's think about what's going on. For a mandible to shift to the right condyle stays put and rotates. On the left side, your lateral pterygoid is contracting, causing translation. You're getting rotation around. So for the mandible to shift to the right, that's a working movement. When the mandible shifts to the right, we're going into a working movement, a right lateral motion, and this would be the working side. Let's ask the same question for the maxilla. We might see an arrow that looks like this. Let's take a look at this arrow. If you see an arrow like this on your test, again, orient yourself. Know that we're looking at the maxilla. Know that the mandible is moving in the direction of the arrow. So which movement would this be representing? That's right, this would be a left lateral movement, and we'd be looking at the non-working side. Put these diagrams to use for you during these movements. Draw arrows, practice thinking through where they would go. Use this as a tool when you get to your test. Make sure and draw this out when you get there. They like to ask questions not just about pathways, but also about which specific cusp would be taking that motion. From our diagram, putting together the picket fence with our occlusal view, we can very clearly see which cusp this is that would take that pathway. Let's go back to our last example. If we look at the origin of that arrow and we're asked which cusp initiates that pathway, we can look at it one of two ways. We can look at the mandibular counterpart and find that it's the mesiobuccal cusp. Or if you're not clear with that, you can also return to your picket fence. We're looking at the second molar, so we come up to second molar on that mesial marginal ridge, and we clearly see that it's the mesiobuccal cusp of that mandibular second molar that would be contacting there. Hopefully these diagrams are really helping. When you get to your test, make sure and draw these out. Use these as a tool. Put them to work for you. I'm going to throw up some questions now. The best way to learn this is through practice. So take a look at these diagrams, draw arrows on them, make them move, make them come to life for you. Here's a bunch of questions. You're going to dominate this section if you can get these down.